Hey, glad you're here. Before we start tonight's story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I love knowing who's still with me through these late night chills. Drop a comment, get comfy, and let the rain lead you into tonight's tale. You know that feeling when you're absolutely certain someone's watching you? Not just the paranoid sort of feeling you get walking alone at night, but that deep, primal awareness that makes every hair on your body stand on end. I felt at the moment I stepped out of my car at the Cherokee National Forest campsite. It was 3 years ago now, but I still dream about it. Still wake up in cold sweats when it rains. I'd driven down from Nashville for what was meant to be a simple weekend camping trip. Work had been mental. 12-hour days, endless meetings, the usual corporate nonsense, and I desperately needed to disconnect. Cherokee seemed perfect, remote enough to guarantee solitude, beautiful enough to clear my head. The drive down had been lovely, actually. Winding mountain roads, autumn leaves just beginning to turn, that crisp October air that makes you feel alive again. But as I pulled into the campsite that Friday evening, the weather was already turning. Dark clouds were gathering overhead, and I could smell rain in the air. The campground was nearly empty, just me and what looked like one other tent pitched way across the clearing. Perfect, I thought, just what I needed. Have you ever been camping alone in the middle of nowhere? There's something both liberating and terrifying about it. The silence is so complete it almost is weight. As I was setting up my tent, the only sounds were the rustle of fabric and the distant whisper of wind through the pines. No traffic, no neighbors, no constant hum of civilization. Just me and the forest. The rain started just as I finished with the tent pegs. Light at first, those fat, lazy drops that promise a proper downpour. I ducked inside my tent and settled in with a book and a thermos of coffee, listening to the gentle patter on the nylon roof. It's one of my favorite sounds, actually. Rain on a tent. Makes you feel cozy and protected, doesn't it? But as the evening wore on, the rain grew heavier. And that's when I first heard it. Footsteps, not the random crack of branches, or the scurry of small animals. Deliberate, measured footsteps circling my campsite. I set down my book and held my breath, straining to listen over the drumming rain. There, again, slow, careful steps in the wet leaves, moving from my left to my right in a wide arc around my tent. My heart started hammering. Could be the other camper. I told myself maybe they needed something, but something felt wrong. The steps were too purposeful, too quiet, like someone trying very hard not to be heard, but not quite managing it. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding thin and uncertain in the darkness. Is someone there? The footsteps stopped immediately. I waited, barely breathing, but heard nothing except the rain. Minutes passed. I was just beginning to convince myself I'd imagined it when I heard them again, this time on the opposite side of my tent. My mouth went dry. Whoever it was had circled completely around me while I wasn't listening. I fumbled for my torch and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. The beam cut through the rain-soaked darkness, illuminating the empty campsite, the dripping trees, the scattered leaves. Nothing. No one. But I could feel eyes on me. That crawling sensation between my shoulder blades that makes you want to spin around and run. I know you're out there, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. What do you want? Silence. Just the relentless patter of rain. I zipped the tent back up and sat there trembling, clutching the torch. My rational mind was working overtime, trying to explain it away. Wild animals, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But deep down I knew better. Animals don't walk with that measured, human gait. Animals don't stop when you call out to them. Do you know that feeling when your body goes into fight or flight mode? Your heart pounds so hard you can feel it in your throat. Your skin goes cold and clammy. Your muscles tense, ready to run or fight. But there's nowhere to go and nothing to fight. I was trapped in a thin shell of nylon in the middle of nowhere, and someone or something was out there in the rain watching me. The footsteps came again around midnight. This time they were closer, much closer. I could hear the squelch of boots and mud just outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to pause at each corner, as if whoever was studying my temporary shelter, looking for the best way in. I gripped my mobile phone, but of course there was no signal. Never is, out there in the mountains. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and I hadn't seen another car for hours before I'd arrived. I was completely, utterly alone. Except I wasn't, was I? Please. I whispered, not even sure if I was praying or pleading with whatever was outside. Please just leave me alone. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent. I could see the impression of boots through the thin wall, just inches from my face. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. I was hyperventilating, but I couldn't seem to slow it down. The torch shook so badly in my hands that the beam danced wildly across the tent walls. Then I heard breathing. Low, slow, deliberate breathing just on the other side of the fabric. Not the quick, panicked breathing of someone caught in the rain, but the patient, steady breathing of someone who had all the time in the world. I bit my lip to keep from crying out. Tears were streaming down my face, and I was shaking so hard I thought the whole tent might collapse. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. But they didn't leave. They just retreated to the edge of the clearing. I could still hear them occasionally. A soft splash in a puddle, the crack of a twig. Whoever it was had settled in to wait, to watch. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I thought I might drift off, I'd hear movement out there in the darkness. Sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there, always present, like a cat playing with a mouse, showing just enough of itself to keep the fear fresh and sharp. Had you ever spent a night in absolute terror? Time becomes elastic. Minutes feel like hours. I must have checked my watch 100 times, willing the sun to rise, praying for dawn to chase away whatever was lurking in the shadows. But October nights are long, and sunrise felt like it would never come. Around 4 in the morning, I heard voices. Not the single presence that had been circling me all night, but multiple voices, speaking in low, urgent whispers just beyond my hearing. I pressed my ear to the tent wall, straining to make out words, but they were speaking too quietly, and the rain was still falling steadily. Were there more of them now? Had others joined whatever had been stalking me? My mind raced with terrible possibilities. Who were they? What did they want? And why had they chosen me, alone and vulnerable in the middle of nowhere? The whispers grew closer, and I caught fragments of conversation. Been watching all night. Should we? Not yet. Almost ready. Ready for what? My blood turned to ice. I fumbled for my camping knife, a pathetic little thing that wouldn't stop a determined child, let alone whatever was out there. But it was all I had. The voices stopped abruptly, as if they'd suddenly realized they were being too loud. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the whispers had been. At least when they were talking, I knew where they were. Now they could be anywhere, surrounding me, closing in. I clutched the knife and waited, my whole body coiled like a spring, ready to fight for my life if they tried to get in. But minutes passed and nothing happened. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the endless drumming of rain. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. A zipper. Someone was slowly, carefully opening the fly of my tent. The sound was barely audible over the rain, but unmistakable. That soft, metallic whisper as the teeth separated, inch by inch. I watched in horror as a gap appeared at the bottom of the tent opening, letting in a stream of cold, wet air. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles went white. This was it. After hours of psychological torture, they were finally making their move. Part of me was almost relieved. At least the waiting was over. The gap widened slowly. An inch, 2 inches. I could see wet leaves and mud beyond the opening, illuminated by occasional flickers of lightning. Still no sign of whoever was opening my tent, but they had to be right there, crouched in the rain, taking their time. "I have a knife," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'll use it if I have to." The zipper stopped moving. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the gap began to close again. The zipper moved back up, sealing me inside once more. I heard footsteps retreating, but only a few steps. Then silence. They were playing with me. Cat and mouse. They could have come in at any time during the night, could have done whatever they wanted to me, but they were drawing it out, savoring my fear, feeding off my terror. Why? What kind of person, what kind of people would do something like this? The rain was beginning to lighten as dawn approached. Through the tent walls, I could see the faintest suggestion of gray light filtering through the storm clouds. I'd made it through the night, but would they let me leave? As the sky slowly brightened, the sound from outside faded away. No more footsteps, no more whispers, no more breathing just beyond the tent walls. By the time proper daylight arrived, the forest seemed completely empty except for me, but I didn't trust it. I waited until full sunrise before I dared unzip the tent and look outside. The campsite looked normal, peaceful even. Rain dripped steadily from the pine branches, and puddles dotted the clearing. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, keys still in my pocket. The other tent across the clearing was gone. Whoever had been there must have packed up and left during the night. But as I looked around more carefully, I saw signs that made my stomach clench with fresh fear. Footprints, dozens of them, all around my tent, pressed deep into mud. Not just one set, but many, different sizes, different treads. Men's boots, women's boots, even what looked like children's shoes. They circled my tent in overlapping patterns, some close enough to touch the fabric, others maintaining a wider perimeter. I counted at least 8 distinct sets of prints. 8 people had been out there in the rain, watching me, surrounding me for the entire night. 8 strangers who had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously. I packed faster than I've ever packed anything in my life. Tent, sleeping bag, gear, everything got shoved into my car in a matter of minutes. I didn't care if I left things behind. I just wanted out of there. But as I was loading the last of my equipment, I found something that made me stop cold. Carved into the bark of the tree right next to my tent, at exactly eye level, was a message. Fresh cuts in the wood, the sap still bleeding. "We know where you live." My hands started shaking again. The cuts were deep, deliberate, made with a sharp knife while I'd been trapped inside my tent. One of them had been standing right there, close enough to touch the fabric, carefully carving those words while I cowered inside. But how could they know where I lived? I'd paid for the campsite with cash, hadn't registered anywhere, hadn't told anyone where I was going. How could they possibly? Then I remembered my car, the number plates. It would be easy enough to trace them back to my address. I ran to my car and drove out of there like the devil himself was chasing me. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, and even then I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see headlights following me, waiting for them to run me off the road. The drive back to Nashville was the longest 3 hours of my life. Every car that pulled up behind me sent my heart racing. Every time I stopped for petrol, I found myself scanning the other customers, wondering if any of them had been in the forest that night, if any of them were the ones who carved that message. When I finally made it home, I double-locked the doors and closed all the curtains. I spent the rest of the weekend jumping at every sound, checking the locks obsessively, peering out the windows at shadows that might or might not be people watching my house. That was 3 years ago. I never found out who they were or what they wanted. I never reported it to the police. What would I have said? That some people walked around my tent and carved a message in a tree? They have thought I was mad. But I'll tell you this. I haven't been camping alone since. Haven't even been able to enjoy the sound of rain without remembering that night. And sometimes, when it's raining hard and the wind is blowing, I still check the locks an extra time before bed, because deep down I know they're still out there, waiting, watching. And on nights like this, when the rain sounds just like it did in Cherokee, I can't shake the feeling that they remember me too. You're listening to this from somewhere safe, I hope, somewhere warm and dry, with locked doors and neighbors nearby. But just for a moment, when you're done listening, step outside and stand in the rain. Close your eyes and listen to the sounds around you, and ask yourself, are you really alone? Because after that night in Cherokee, I learned something that's haunted me ever since. We're never as alone as we think we are. There are always watchers in the darkness, patient and silent, waiting for the perfect moment to let you know they're there. I just pray you never find out what they want. I've always been drawn to old places. You know the sort. Abandoned buildings, forgotten graveyards, places where history seems to seep from the very ground. So when I heard about the Cherokee National Forest and its reputation for, well, let's call them unusual experiences, I knew I had to see it for myself. It was late September, 3 years back. I'd driven down from Memphis with my camping gear and a head full of curiosity. The forest has this reputation, you see. Local Cherokee legends speak of it as a thin place, somewhere the barrier between our world and something else grows fragile. Most people dismiss it as tourist nonsense, but I've always been fascinated by folklore. There's usually a grain of truth buried in even the wildest stories. The campsite I'd chosen was one of the more remote ones, tucked away in a valley that felt like it hadn't changed in centuries. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches so thick they blocked out most of the sky. The air itself felt different there, heavier somehow, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I'd set up my tent near a small creek that wound through the site. The sound of running water has always helped me sleep, and after the long drive, I was looking forward to a peaceful night under the stars. But as evening approached, the weather began to turn. Clouds rolled in from the west, dark and pregnant with rain. Have you ever noticed how forests change when a storm approaches? The animals go quiet first. Then the wind picks up, making the trees whisper secrets to each other in languages we've forgotten. By the time I'd finished setting up camp, the first drops were beginning to fall. I ducked into my tent and settled in with a book about Cherokee mythology I'd picked up in town. Fascinating stuff, actually. Stories about shapeshifters and shadow people, about places where the dead could still touch the living. The author mentioned this very forest several times, describing it as a place where the old ways still hold power. The rain started in earnest around 9 o'clock. Not the gentle patter you might expect, but a proper downpour that drummed against my tent like 1,000 tiny fists. I love that sound, don't you? Rain on canvas or nylon. It's like nature's own white noise machine. I was just beginning to drift off when I noticed something odd. There was light coming from somewhere behind me. Not the harsh glare of an electric torch, but a soft, flickering glow like candlelight or firelight. I turned around, expecting to see another camper's lantern through the tent wall, but that was impossible. I'd checked the entire campsite when I'd arrived. I was completely alone. I unzipped the back window of my tent, just a small panel of mesh that I used for ventilation, and peered out into the rain-soaked darkness. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. About 50 meters away, barely visible through the trees in the driving rain, was a mirror. Not a small bathroom mirror, mind you, but a large, ornate thing that must have been 6 feet tall. It was propped against a massive oak tree, its surface reflecting that strange, flickering light I'd seen. The mirror looked ancient, the kind you might find in a Victorian mansion, with an elaborate silver frame that gleamed despite the rain. What was a mirror doing in the middle of the forest? My first thought was that it must belong to another camper, some sort of portable camping mirror, though I'd never seen one that large or ornate. But as I watched, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The reflection in the mirror didn't match what should have been there. The mirror was facing toward my tent, positioned so that it should have reflected me looking out through the mesh window. But instead, the surface showed something else entirely. A figure standing in what looked like bright daylight, arms raised as if beckoning. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was seeing things. The rain was coming down hard, and perhaps the drops on the mesh were distorting my vision. But when I looked again, the figure was still there, clearer now. It was definitely human-shaped, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, perhaps, or too thin. And its movements were too fluid, too graceful, like a dancer performing in slow motion. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely audible over the rain. "Is someone there?" The figure in the mirror stopped moving and seemed to turn toward me. Even though I couldn't make out any features at that distance, I had the distinct impression it was looking directly at me, studying me. My heart started racing. This was impossible. Mirrors don't work that way. They reflect what's in front of them, not whatever this was. I grabbed my torch and unzipped the tent flap, determined to investigate. The beam of my torch cut through the rain, illuminating the trees, the undergrowth, the creek running nearby. But where the mirror should have been, there was nothing. Just an empty space between 2 oak trees, rain dripping from the branches. I stood there in the doorway of my tent, getting soaked, staring at empty forest. Had I imagined it? But I could have sworn. I played the torch beam over the area again, looking for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. Feeling foolish, I retreated back into my tent and zipped it up. I must have been more tired than I'd thought. Tricks of the light, shadows and rain playing games with my eyes. It happens to everyone, doesn't it? Especially in unfamiliar places. But as I settled back down with my book, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. You know, that crawling sensation between your shoulder blades, that primitive awareness that some predator has you in its sights? It was so strong I kept turning around, expecting to see someone crouch behind me in the tent. The rain continued to pound down, and I tried to lose myself in the Cherokee legends. One story caught my attention, a tale about mirrors and reflections that didn't belong to their owners. According to the legend, certain places in the forest could show you things that existed in what the Cherokee called the Shadow World, a realm that paralleled our own but was populated by entities that had never been human. These beings, the story claimed, were curious about our world and would sometimes try to make contact through reflections, but they were dangerous to interact with because they didn't understand human limitations. They might try to pull you into their realm, or worse, try to take your place in ours. Superstitious nonsense, of course. But as I read, I found myself glancing nervously at the back window of my tent, half expecting to see that impossible mirror again. Around midnight, I did. This time it was closer, much closer. The mirror now stood just outside my tent, perhaps 10 feet away, clearly visible through the mesh window. The same ornate frame, the same flickering light emanating from its surface. But the reflection had changed. Instead of the tall, graceful figure, I now saw myself, or rather, a version of myself. The reflection showed me sitting in my tent, reading my book, just as I was doing, but there were differences. Subtle at first, then more pronounced. The me in the mirror was wearing different clothes. Not my camping gear, but a suit I'd never owned. The tent behind Mirror Me was larger, more elaborate, made of what looked like canvas instead of modern nylon. And Mirror Me's face. There was something wrong with Mirror Me's face. I leaned closer to the mesh window, trying to make out the details. The rain was still coming down hard, creating a constant stream of water down the tent's exterior. But I could see clearly enough to know that whatever was looking back at me from that mirror wasn't quite me. Mirror Me smiled. I wasn't smiling. My blood went cold. I watched, frozen with terror, as my reflection grinned at me with too many teeth. Its eyes, my eyes, were completely black, like looking into deep water at night. And as I watched, Mirror Me raised one hand and waved. I jerked back from the window, so hard I knocked over my thermos of coffee. The hot liquid soaked through my sleeping bag, but I barely noticed. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel in my throat, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. This wasn't possible. Reflections don't act independently. Mirrors don't appear in the middle of forests and show you versions of yourself that don't exist. I was losing my mind. Had to be. The isolation, the strange atmosphere of the forest, the Cherokee legends I'd been reading. It was all combining to create some sort of psychotic break. But when I forced myself to look out the window again, the mirror was still there. And Mirror Me was still grinning that horrible, too wide grin. "What do you want?" I whispered, not really expecting an answer. Mirror Me's mouth moved, as if it were speaking, but I couldn't hear any words over the rain. It gestured toward me, then toward itself, then made a motion like it was opening a door. It wanted me to come outside. Every instinct I had screamed against it. Whatever this thing was, wherever this mirror had come from, getting closer to it was the last thing I should do. But I found myself reaching for the tent zipper anyway, as if my hand was moving of its own accord. The rational part of my mind was screaming warnings. Don't go out there. Don't trust what you're seeing. Stay in the tent. Wait for morning. Then get the hell out of the forest. But there was another part of me, a deeper part, that was desperately curious. What would happen if I approached the mirror? What would I see if I got close enough to touch it? I unzipped the tent flap just a few inches and peered out. The mirror stood exactly where I'd seen it through the window, rain streaming down its surface, but somehow not obscuring the reflection. Mirror Me was still there, still grinning, still gesturing for me to come closer. "I know you're not real," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the rain. "Mirrors don't work that way." Mirror Me shook its head, as if disagreeing with me. Then it pointed to itself, then to me, then held up one finger. One, as if it were trying to tell me something about the number one. One what? One mirror? One reflection? One chance? Or one of us would remain? The thought hit me like a physical blow. What if this thing wasn't just showing me a distorted reflection? What if it was trying to replace me? The Cherokee legend I had read mentioned entities from the shadow world attempting to take human form. What if this mirror was some sort of gateway, and the thing on the other side was studying me, learning how to be me? I started to zip the tent back up, but Mirror Me held up both hands in what looked like a pleading gesture. It pointed to itself again, then made a motion like it was trapped, pressing its palms against the inside surface of the mirror as if it were a window instead of reflection. Was it trying to tell me it was trapped? That it needed help? Despite every warning bell going off in my head, I felt a stab of sympathy. If something was trapped in there, if it was in pain or afraid. But then I remembered the too wide grin, the black eyes, the wrong number of teeth. Whatever was in that mirror, it wasn't human, and it wasn't necessarily telling the truth about being trapped. "I can't help you," I said. "I'm sorry, but I can't." Mirror Me's expression changed instantly. The pleading look vanished, replaced by something cold and hungry. It pressed both hands against the mirror's surface and pushed, as if trying to break through. For a terrifying moment, I thought I saw the glass begin to bulge outward, straining under the pressure. Then Mirror Me threw back its head and screamed. I couldn't hear the sound over the rain, but I could see its mouth open impossibly wide, could see the fury and frustration in every line of its body. It beat its fist against the inside of the mirror, and I swear I could feel the vibrations through the ground. I zipped the tent shut and scrambled as far back as I could get, pressing myself against the rear wall. The mirror was right there, just a few feet away, and something inside it was having what looked like a violent tantrum. What if it broke through? What if it found a way out? The tantrum seemed to go on forever. I sat huddled in my sleeping bag, shaking with fear, waiting for the sound of breaking glass. But it never came. Eventually, the movement in the mirror stopped. An eerie calm settled over the campsite. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there in the darkness, listening to the rain, jumping at every sound. Every few minutes, I'd work up the courage to peek out the back window, and every time, the mirror was still there, but Mirror Me was gone. The surface now showed only my tent, reflected normally, as if nothing had happened. As dawn approached, the rain began to taper off. Gray light filtered through the clouds, and the forest slowly came alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. Normal sounds. Reassuring sounds. When I finally looked out the window again, the mirror was gone. I packed up my camp in record time and drove straight home to Memphis. I didn't stop except for petrol. Didn't even pause to grab breakfast. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever I'd encountered in that forest. For weeks afterward, I found myself avoiding mirrors. Not completely. That would have been impossible. But I was careful not to look too closely at my reflection, especially when I was alone, because sometimes just for a split second, I thought I saw something wrong. A smile when I wasn't smiling. Eyes that were just a shade too dark. A face that was almost, but not quite, my own. Those episodes faded with time, and I convinced myself they were just echoes of that night in the forest. Trauma playing tricks on my mind. But I never went camping alone again, and I never returned to Cherokee National Forest. That was 3 years ago. I thought I'd put behind me, learn to live with the memory of that impossible night. But last week, something happened that brought it all rushing back. I was in an antique shop in downtown Memphis, browsing through old furniture when I saw it. In the back corner of the shop, partially hidden behind a wardrobe, was a mirror, large, ornate, with an elaborate silver frame that gleamed despite a layer of dust. It was the same mirror. I was absolutely certain of it. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding. The shopkeeper noticed my interest and came over, wiping his hands on a rag. "Beautiful piece, isn't it?" he said. "Found it abandoned in the Cherokee National Forest. If you can believe that, some hikers reported it. Said it had been left propped against a tree after a storm. Park Service brought it to me rather than just throw it away. Shame to waste something so lovely." I stared at my reflection in the mirror's surface. Just me, looking pale and shaken, exactly as I should look. Nothing wrong with the proportions. Nothing unusual about the eyes or teeth. Just a normal reflection of a normal man in a normal antique shop. But as I watched, my reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. I backed away from the mirror. So fast I knocked over a small table, sending several antique vases crashing to the floor. The shopkeeper cursed and started gathering up the pieces, demanding to know what was wrong with me. I threw some money at him for the broken vases and ran. I could hear him shouting after me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. That was a week ago. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. The mirror is out there in that antique shop, waiting, and whatever was trapped inside it during that night in the forest, I don't think it's trapped anymore. You see, I've been doing some research. Cherokee legends about mirrors and reflections, and I found something that's kept me awake for the past 7 nights. According to the old stories, when one of these shadow beings successfully makes contact through a mirror, it creates what they call a tether, a connection between our world and theirs. The more you interact with the reflection, the stronger the tether becomes. And eventually, the reflection doesn't need the mirror anymore. I've been seeing it everywhere now. In shop windows as I walk past, in the black screen of my turned-off television, in puddles after it rains. Always the same wrong smile, the same 2 dark eyes, always watching me, studying me, learning to be me, and I think it's getting better at it. This morning, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror, and for just a moment, I looked exactly right. No wrong smiles, no strange proportions. Just me, perfectly reflected. That's what scares me most of all. Because if it can look exactly like me in the mirror, how long before it looks exactly like me everywhere else? You're safe where you are listening to this. Your mirrors are just mirrors. Your reflections are just reflections. But if you ever find yourself camping in Cherokee National Forest and you see a mirror where no mirror should be, don't look too closely. And whatever you do, don't let it see you looking back. Have you ever heard your own voice coming from somewhere it shouldn't be? Not an echo, not a recording you've forgotten about, but your actual voice speaking words you've never said? It's the most unsettling thing you can imagine. Makes you question everything you think you know about reality. I learned this the hard way during what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip to Cherokee National Forest. It was October 2021, and I've been looking forward to getting away from everything. Work stress, relationship problems, the constant noise of modern life. I just wanted to sit by a campfire, listen to the sounds of nature, and maybe catch up on some reading. Simple pleasures, you know? I'd driven down from Knoxville on a Friday afternoon, taking the scenic route through the mountains. The autumn colors were spectacular that year. Brilliant reds and golds that made the whole forest look like it was on fire. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The campground was nearly empty, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. Just me and one other camper way across the clearing. An elderly gentleman who gave me a friendly wave as I unpacked my gear. Perfect. I'd have all the peace and quiet I could want. I brought along an old transistor radio, one of those vintage models from the 70s that still picked up signals better than most modern devices. My grandfather had given it to me years ago, and I loved having it when I camped. There's something soothing about listening to distant radio stations while you're sitting around a campfire, isn't there? The crackle of static, the fading in and out of far-off voices. It makes you feel connected to the wider world, even when you're in the middle of nowhere. As I was setting up my tent, dark clouds began rolling in from the west. The weather forecast had called for possible showers, but the way those clouds looked, we were in for more than just a light drizzle. The air itself felt heavy with moisture, and that peculiar stillness that comes before a storm had settled over the forest. I hurried to finish my camp setup before the rain started. Tent secured, sleeping bag laid out, campfire ring cleared and ready. Just as I was organizing my gear, the first drops began to fall. Big, fat raindrops that splatter on the leaves above me with sounds like tiny explosions. I ducked into my tent and decided to test the radio while I waited out the storm. The old Panasonic crackled to life, and I began scanning to the frequencies, looking for something interesting to listen to. The FM band was mostly static at first, but as I worked my way up the dial, I began picking up stations. 94.7, a country music station from somewhere in Tennessee. 101.3, classic rock, probably broadcasting from Knoxville. 105.9, a talk radio show discussing local politics. Nothing particularly engaging, but it was nice to have human voices for company as the rain began coming down harder. I was just about to settle on the classic rock station when I stumbled across something odd. 87.9 FM was broadcasting what sounded like a conversation between two people, but there was something strange about the audio quality. It wasn't the usual crisp, professional sound you'd expect from a radio station. Instead, it had that slightly hollow, echo-y quality you get from old walkie-talkies or CB radios. Like listening to people talking in an empty room. The voices were discussing camping, of all things. A man and a woman, both sounding middle-aged, talking about their favorite spots in various national forests. Nothing unusual about the topic, but something about their conversation felt rehearsed, like they were reading from a script rather than having a natural discussion. Cherokee National Forest is lovely this time of year, the woman was saying. The autumn colors are simply spectacular. Oh, yes, the man agreed. We always enjoy our trips there. Such peaceful campsites. So remote, so isolated. The way he said that last word made me uncomfortable. There was something almost predatory about his tone, like isolation was exactly what he was hoping for. I was about to change the station when the woman spoke again. We should tell our listeners about the best camping spots. Help them find those really secluded areas where they can be completely alone. Excellent idea, the man replied. Let's start with coordinates. Then they began rattling off GPS coordinates for various locations throughout Cherokee National Forest. Not general area descriptions like you'd expect from a normal travel show, but precise latitude and longitude readings. Who does that on a radio program? And why would you want to guide people to the most isolated spots unless you had reasons for wanting to find lone campers? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. This wasn't a legitimate radio show. The more I listened, the more convinced I became that something was seriously wrong. The hosts' voices were too flat, too emotionless. They spoke like people reading a phone directory, not like enthusiastic outdoors enthusiasts sharing their passion. And then they mentioned my campsite. Grid reference 35.9847, minus 83.4521, the woman said. Lovely spot by a small creek. Perfect for a single tent. Very private. My blood went cold. Those coordinates, I was almost certain they were describing exactly where I was sitting. But how could they know? I hadn't registered my specific location with anyone. Hadn't posted on social media. Hadn't even told my friends exactly which campsite I'd chosen. Yes, the man agreed. I believe someone is camping there right now. Actually, arrived this evening, driving a blue Honda Civic. I scrambled for my car keys and checked the tag. Blue Honda Civic. They were talking about me. My hand started shaking as I adjusted the radio's antenna, trying to get a clearer signal. This had to be some sort of coincidence. Maybe they were talking about a different campsite, a different camper. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew better. The coordinates were too specific, the details too accurate. Should we pay him a visit? The woman asked, and there was something in her voice that made my skin crawl. A sort of anticipation, like a predator discussing its next meal. Not yet, the man replied. Let's wait until he's settled in for the night, until he's completely alone and vulnerable. I fumbled with the radio dial, trying to find the station's call letters or any other identifying information, but 87.9 FM didn't seem to exist according to any official frequency listings I could remember. It was broadcasting on what should have been dead air, an unused part of the spectrum. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against my tent with increasing intensity. Through the sound of the downpour, I could hear the conversation on the radio continuing, but now they were discussing other campers, other isolated sites, other people who thought they were safe in the wilderness. The fellow at Cosby Campground won't be expecting visitors, the woman said. Tent pitched behind a large boulder, away from the main loop. And that family at Elkmont, the man added, parents asleep, children in a separate tent. So trusting, they were cataloging targets, tracking people throughout the entire national forest system, somehow watching them without being seen, planning. What did they want with isolated campers? I needed to get out of there, right now. But as I reached for my car keys, the radio crackled with a new voice, a voice that stopped me cold. It was my own voice. Cherokee National Forest is lovely this time of year. I heard myself saying through the radio speaker, the autumn colors are simply spectacular. But I hadn't said those words. I was sitting in stunned silence, listening to my own voice having a conversation I'd never had. Oh, yes. Came another voice, the original male host. We always enjoy our trips there. Tell us, what brings you to Cherokee this weekend? Just needed to get away, my voice replied. Work stress, relationship problems. You know how it is. Sometimes you just need to disappear for a while. The conversation continued, with my voice providing details about my life that no one should have known. Personal information, private thoughts, even things I'd never spoken aloud to anyone. Somehow, impossibly, the radio was broadcasting an interview with me that had never taken place. And you're camping alone? The female host asked. Completely alone, my voice confirmed. No one knows exactly where I am. I could disappear out here and no one would find me for days. How convenient, the male host said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I jabbed at the radio's power button, desperately trying to turn it off, but nothing happened. The conversation continued, my voice cheerfully providing a detailed description of my campsite, my schedule, even my planned hiking routes for the next day. The rain's really coming down now, my voice said. I should probably get some sleep soon. Long day of hiking ahead tomorrow. Sleep well, the female host said. We'll be listening. The transmission cut to static, then silence. I sat there in my tent, heart pounding, staring at the radio. This was impossible. Radios don't broadcast conversations that never happened. They don't somehow extract your voice and thoughts and beam them out over the airwaves. But I'd heard it with my own ears. My voice, my words, my private information being discussed as if I were participating in some sort of twisted talk show. The rational part of my mind was scrambling for explanations. Elaborate prank, maybe hidden cameras, voice synthesis technology, some sort of reality TV setup. But who would go to such lengths? And how would they have gotten access to such personal information about me? I tried tuning to other stations, looking for something normal, something that would convince me I hadn't completely lost my mind. But every frequency I tried was either dead static or more of those strange, hollow voices discussing campers throughout the forest. Different hosts, different locations, but always the same predatory undertone. The same sense of people being watched and cataloged. And then, around midnight, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps outside my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling my campsite in the rain. But these weren't random sounds. They were perfectly synchronized with a broadcast I was picking up on 91.7 FM. A live commentary describing someone walking around a tent in Cherokee National Forest. Approaching from the south, a voice on the radio said, and I heard footsteps splashing through puddles to my left. Moving to the east side now. The voice continued, and the footsteps move accordingly. Subject appears to be awake and listening, the radio voice observed, and I realized with growing horror that they were providing real-time commentary on what was happening to me. I grabbed my torch and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer outside. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the trees, the creek, the scattered camping gear. But I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps continued. I could hear them clearly, both outside my tent and through the radio, but there was no one there. Visual contact confirmed. The radio voice said, subject is using artificial light source to scan perimeter. How could they see me when I couldn't see them? Recommend maintaining distance for now. Another voice added. Subject appears agitated. I was more than agitated. I was terrified. Somehow, people I couldn't see were watching me, commenting on my every move, broadcasting their observations to whom? Who was listening to this twisted surveillance network? I retreated back into my tent and zipped it shut, but the footsteps continued, and the radio commentary never stopped. Subject has returned to shelter. The first voice reported, recommend proceeding to Phase 2. Phase 2? What the hell was Phase 2? I found out a few minutes later when my radio began broadcasting something that made no sense at all. It was my voice again, but this time I was apparently having a phone conversation with my sister back home in Knoxville. Hey, Sarah, my voice said through the radio speaker. Just wanted to let you know I made it to the forest safely. Oh, good, came Sarah's voice. How's the weather? Bit rainy, but not too bad, my voice replied. Listen, I've decided to extend my trip. Going to stay out here for another week or so. Really? That's not like you. I know, but it's so peaceful here. So isolated. I think I need more time to clear my head. Well, as long as you're safe, Sarah said. Should I tell Mom and Dad you'll be unreachable for a while? Yeah, that would be great. Tell them not to worry if they don't hear from me. I'm going to go completely off-grid for a bit. The conversation continued, with my voice making arrangements to ensure that no one would come looking for me if I didn't return home as scheduled. It was brilliant in a horrifying way. If I disappeared from this campsite, my own voice had just provided the perfect cover story. But I'd never made that phone call. I didn't even have cell service out here. I checked my phone. No signal, just as I'd expected. So how had they managed to broadcast a conversation between me and my sister using our actual voices? And more importantly, how had they known Sarah's name, her voice, the exact way she spoke? The footsteps outside had stopped, but I could still hear voices on the radio discussing Phase 3. Whatever that meant, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed my gear as quietly as possible, stuffing everything into my backpack without bothering to organize it properly. The tent could stay. I wasn't going to waste time breaking it down properly in the rain. I just needed to get to my car and get out of there. But as I crept toward the tent entrance, my radio crackled with a new transmission. Subject is attempting to leave. A voice reported. Vehicle has been disabled. My heart sank. I unzipped the tent flap and played my torch beam over my car. The tires had been slashed. All 4 of them. My Honda sat in the rain like a beach whale, completely useless. Phase 4 is a go, the radio announced, converging on target location. That's when I started running. I crashed through the forest in the darkness, branches whipping at my face, roots trying to trip me with every step. The rain made everything slippery and treacherous, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I could hear voices, not from a radio this time, but actual voices calling each other through the trees. This way. He went toward the creek, cut him off at the trail junction. They were hunting me like an animal. I splashed across the creek and scrambled up the opposite bank, my torch beam dancing wildly as I tried to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. The voices behind me seemed to be getting closer, and I could see other torch beams flickering through the trees. How many of them were there, and what did they want with me? I found a hiking trail and followed it deeper into the forest, hoping to lose them in the maze of paths that crisscross the park. But every time I thought I'd gained some distance, I'd hear voices calling out coordinates, directing the search. He's on the red trail, heading north. Team 3, move to intercept. Remember, we need him alive. Alive. That was both reassuring and terrifying. They didn't want to kill me, but what they did want might be worse than death. I ran for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. My lungs were burning, my legs were shaking, and I was soaked to the bone. But gradually, the voices behind me faded. Either I'd lost them, or they'd given up the chase. I found myself on a paved road, probably the main park highway. If I could flag down a passing car, maybe I could get help. But at 3 in the morning in the middle of a rainstorm, traffic was non-existent. I started walking toward what I hoped was the park entrance, staying in the shadows beside the road. That's when I heard the radio again, not from a device I was carrying. I'd left my grandfather's radio back at the campsite, but somehow the voices were coming from the forest itself, echoing through the trees like some sort of supernatural broadcast. Subject has reached the main road. A voice announced, Implementing contingency protocol. Copy that. Switching to frequency 103.5 for final phase. The voices faded, leaving only the sound of rain and my own labored breathing. But I knew they were still out there, still watching, still coordinating their efforts to recapture me. I walked for 2 hours before I saw headlights approaching. A park ranger's vehicle, driving slowly through the rain. I flagged it down, and the ranger, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, rolled down her window. "You all right, son? You look like you've been through hell." I poured out my story, babbling about the radio broadcasts, the surveillance, the slashed tires, the chase through the forest. I know I sounded crazy, but she listened patiently, nodding and making sympathetic noises. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry," she said finally. "Then we can sort this all out." She drove me to the ranger station, gave me hot coffee and a blanket, and took down my report. She was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about everything I'd experienced. But I could see the skepticism in her eyes. She thought I was either lying or having some sort of breakdown. "We'll check on your campsite," she promised, "and we'll look into these radio transmissions you mentioned. But I have to tell you, son, we've never had reports of anything like this before." They found my campsite the next morning. The tent was still there, along with most of my gear. But the radio was gone, and there was no sign that anyone else had been there. No footprints, no evidence of struggle, nothing to corroborate my story. The tires on my car were indeed slashed, but a ranger suggested it might have been vandalism by local troublemakers. "It happens sometimes," she said. "Bored teenagers looking for mischief." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to write the whole thing off as an overactive imagination combined with stress and isolation. But I couldn't forget what I'd heard on that radio. My own voice, having conversations I'd never had. The perfect coordination between the footsteps outside my tent and the commentary I was hearing. The impossible knowledge of personal details no stranger should have possessed. 3 days later, I was back home in Knoxville, trying to return to normal life. But normal felt impossible now. Every radio I encountered made me nervous. Every time I heard my own voice on a voicemail I'd left in a video someone had taken, I found myself wondering if somehow, somewhere it was being broadcast without my knowledge. And then, a week after my return, my sister Sarah called me. "That was weird," she said without preamble. "What was weird?" "The other night, when you called me from the forest, I could have sworn we had a whole conversation about you extending your trip. But when I woke up the next morning, I couldn't remember the details. And then you came home right on schedule, like we'd never talked at all." My blood went cold. "Sarah, I never called you from the forest. I didn't have cell service." There was a long pause. "But I remember talking to you. I remember your voice." "What exactly do you remember?" "You said you were going to stay longer, go off-grid for a while. You asked me to tell Mom and Dad not to worry if they didn't hear from you." It was exactly the conversation I'd heard on the radio, word for word. "Sarah," I said carefully, "do you remember what time this conversation happened?" "Around midnight, I think. Maybe a bit later. I was already in bed." The same time I'd been listening to the impossible broadcast in my tent. We talked for another few minutes, but neither of us could make sense of it. Sarah was certain we'd had a phone conversation that I was equally certain had never happened. But if it hadn't happened, how did she remember it so clearly? And how had her voice ended up on that mysterious radio frequency? That was 2 years ago. I never went back to Cherokee National Forest, and I've never been able to explain what happened to me that night. But sometimes when I'm scanning through radio stations in my car, I'll catch fragments of those hollow, emotionless voices discussing coordinates and camping schedules. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear my own voice among them. Last month, a friend of mine went missing during a solo camping trip to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He'd told his family he was only going for a weekend, but when Monday came and he hadn't returned, they called the authorities. They found his campsite intact, his car undamaged, but no sign of him anywhere. The strange thing is, his wife received a phone call the night he disappeared. A call from his voice telling her he decided to extend his trip, that he was going off-grid for a while, and not to worry if she didn't hear from him. She swears it was his voice. But the call came from a number that didn't exist, during a time when his phone showed no outgoing calls. He's still missing. I think about that radio frequency sometimes. 87.9 FM, broadcasting from nowhere, using voices that belong to people who never said those words. And I wonder how many other campers have heard their own voices coming from places they shouldn't, making plans they never made, having conversations that never happened. If you ever find yourself camping alone in Cherokee National Forest, bring a radio. Scan through the frequencies, especially the low end of the FM band. If you hear your own voice coming back at you, don't listen to what it's saying. And whatever you do, don't stick around to find out what Phase 4 involves. Because I have a terrible feeling that some of the voices on those broadcasts belong to people who never made it home. Have you ever lived the same day twice? I don't mean deja vu or that strange feeling when something seems familiar. I mean actually living through identical events, making the same choices, having the same conversations, watching the same rainfall at precisely the same moments. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? Like something out of a film. But I'm telling you, it happened to me in Cherokee National Forest, and I'm still not entirely convinced it's over. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip. October 15th through 17th, 2022. I'd booked the dates months in advance, looking forward to a long weekend away from the chaos of Atlanta. My job in IT support was burning me out, and I desperately needed some time in nature to reset my mind. I drove down from the city on a Friday morning, taking the scenic route through the mountains. The autumn colors were absolutely stunning that year, deep reds and brilliant golds that made the entire forest look like it was painted by some cosmic artist. I'd made this drive dozens of times over the years, but it never failed to lift my spirits. The campsite I'd chosen was one of the more remote ones, tucked into a valley surrounded by ancient oaks and towering pines. There was something almost cathedral-like about the place, the way the massive trees formed natural arches overhead, filtering the sunlight into soft, green-tinted beams. Perfect for a weekend of reading, hiking, and general contemplation. I arrived around noon and spent the afternoon setting up camp and exploring the nearby trails. The weather was magnificent, crisp and clear, with just enough chill in the air to make you feel alive. I cooked a simple dinner over my camp stove, watched the sun set through the trees, and settled in for what I expected to be a peaceful night's sleep. But around midnight, the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled in with surprising speed, and within minutes, a steady rain began to fall. I love the sound of rain on a tent, so I wasn't bothered. If anything, it added to the cozy atmosphere. I drifted off to sleep, listening to the gentle patter on the nylon roof. I woke up the next morning, Saturday, October 16th, feeling refreshed and ready for a day of hiking. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving everything clean and glistening. I made coffee, had a quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit, and set off on the Red Creek Trail around 9 o'clock. It was a lovely hike. The trail wound through old-growth forest, past cascading streams and moss-covered boulders. I saw a deer, a red-tailed hawk, even what might have been a black bear in the distance. By the time I returned to my campsite around 4 in the afternoon, I felt like a new person. This was exactly what I'd needed. The evening followed a similar pattern to the night before. Simple dinner, magnificent sunset, the gradual settling of darkness over the forest. And right around midnight, the same dark clouds rolled in, bringing the same steady rain. I woke up on Sunday morning, October 17th, my last day, planning to break camp and head home after a final short hike. But as I was making my coffee, something strange happened. A deer wandered into my campsite. A young doe, moving with that careful, graceful step deer have when they're not quite sure about their surroundings. She approached my picnic table, looked directly at me for several seconds, then bounded away into the forest. It was charming, really, the sort of magical wildlife encounter that makes camping so special. I wished I'd had my camera ready. But then, 20 minutes later, the exact same deer appeared again. Same approach, same hesitant steps, same direct eye contact with the same number of seconds, same graceful bound into the forest. And I do mean exactly the same. The deer moved through identical motions, as if it were following some sort of choreographed routine. That was odd, but not impossible. Animals are creatures of habit, after all. Maybe this doe had a regular route through the campsite. I finished my coffee and began packing up my gear. But as I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I heard voices approaching from the trail. A couple, middle-aged, discussing their plans for the day. "I think we should try the waterfall trail," the woman was saying. "Are you sure? It looked pretty steep on the map," the man replied. "We can turn back if it gets too difficult. Come on, live a little." They passed by my campsite, gave me a friendly wave, and continued on toward the trailhead. Nice people, clearly experienced hikers from the look of their gear. But here's the thing. 15 minutes later, I heard the exact same conversation. The same voices, the same words, the same intonation. I looked up from my packing, and there they were again, the same couple, having the identical discussion about the waterfall trail, as if they were reading from a script. "I think we should try the waterfall trail. Are you sure? It looked pretty steep on the map. We can turn back if it gets too difficult. Come on, live a little." Same wave, same friendly smiles, same route toward the trailhead. I stood there staring after them, feeling deeply unsettled. This wasn't normal. Animals might repeat behaviors, but people don't have word-for-word identical conversations 15 minutes apart. Unless they were actors, perhaps? Was I unknowingly camped in the middle of some sort of film production? But I hadn't seen any cameras, any crew members, any equipment. Just a couple, moving through their routine like wind-up toys. I tried to shake off the strange feeling and continued packing. But over the next hour, I witnessed the same scene 3 more times. The deer, the couple, even a squirrel that knocked over my coffee cup in exactly the same manner at exactly 20-minute intervals. Something was very wrong. By the time I loaded my car and was ready to leave, I was thoroughly spooked. The forest felt different somehow, less real, more like a stage set where the same performance was being repeated over and over. I drove toward the park exit, eager to get back to the normal world, where deer didn't follow scripts and couples didn't have identical conversations multiple times. I'd driven the route dozens of times over the years. Straight road through the forest, then a left turn at the ranger station, then 5 miles to the park boundary. Simple, impossible to get lost. But after driving for what felt like an hour, I found myself back at my campsite. I sat in my car, staring at the familiar clearing where I'd spent the weekend, trying to process what had just happened. I knew I'd driven in a straight line away from the camp. I knew I hadn't made any turns or detours. But somehow, impossibly, I was back where I'd started. I tried again. Same route, same careful attention to the road, same impossible result. Back at the campsite after an hour of driving through forest that should have led me to the exit. On the third attempt, panic began to set in. This wasn't getting lost. This was something else entirely. The roads themselves seemed to be folding back on themselves, creating some sort of loop that always returned me to the same place. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. There never was out here in the mountains. But my phone showed something that made my blood run cold. The date was October 16th, not October 17th, as it should have been. According to my phone, it was still Saturday. But I distinctly remembered waking up on Sunday morning, remembered packing my gear to go home, remembered the repeated encounters with the deer and the hiking couple. I checked my watch. Same date. I turned on my car radio, hoping to hear a time and date announcement from a local station. When I finally found a clear signal, the DJ confirmed it. Saturday, October 16th. But how could that be? I remembered living through Saturday already. I remembered the hike on the Red Creek Trail, the wildlife sightings, the sunset from my campsite. All of it was crystal clear in my memory, unless I dreamed it. But it felt so real, so detailed. And I was still packed up and ready to leave, which I certainly wouldn't be if I'd only imagined the next day. Confused and more than a little frightened, I drove back to my campsite. If it really was still Saturday, I might as well set up camp again and try to make sense of what was happening. Maybe I'd had some sort of blackout, or maybe the isolation was affecting my mind more than I'd realized. I unpacked my gear and set up my tent in the exact same spot I'd used before. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself anticipating events. The deer would appear around 4:30. I knew. The hiking couple would pass by shortly after 5. The sun would set at 6:47, painting the sky in specific shades of orange and red. And everything happened exactly as I expected. The deer wandered into my campsite at precisely 4:28, following the same choreographed routine I'd witnessed that morning. The hiking couple appeared at 5:03, having their scripted conversation about the waterfall trail. The sunset was identical to the one I remembered from the night before, down to the pattern of clouds and the specific way the light filtered through the trees. Around midnight, the same dark clouds rolled in, bringing the same steady rain. I woke up on Sunday morning, or what my memory insisted was Sunday morning, though my phone still showed Saturday with a growing sense of dread. If I was right, if I was somehow reliving the same day, then I would witness the same sequence of events again. The deer, the couple, the failed attempt to leave the park. And I was right. Every single event repeated itself exactly. Not similar events, not coincidental encounters, but precise duplicates of everything I had experienced before. I began timing them with my watch. The deer appeared at 4 hours, 28 minutes, and 17 seconds. The couple's conversation began at 5 hours, 3 minutes, and 42 seconds. The squirrel knocked over my coffee cup at 5 hours, 47 minutes, and 9 seconds. It was like being trapped in some sort of temporal recording, forced to watch the same performance over and over while remaining powerfully aware that I'd seen it all before. I tried changing my own behavior, hoping to break whatever pattern I was caught in. Instead of hiking, I stayed at the campsite. Instead of coffee, I had tea. Instead of sitting at the picnic table, I remained in my tent. It didn't matter. The deer still appeared at exactly the same time. The couple still passed by with their identical conversation. The sun still set in the same spectacular fashion. My actions could vary, but everything else remained locked in its predetermined sequence. I've always been a logical person. I work with computers, with systems that follow predictable rules. What I was experiencing violated every rational principle I understood about how the world works. Time doesn't loop. Days don't repeat. Effects don't precede causes. But logic couldn't explain away what I was living through. Day after day, or the same day, repeated endlessly. I woke up to identical weather patterns, identical wildlife encounters, identical conversations from passing hikers. I tried everything I could think of to break the cycle. I packed up early and waited in my car. I hiked different trails. I even tried sleeping through the entire day. Nothing worked. October 16th, 2022, just kept happening. The truly maddening part was that I retained memories of each repetition, while everything else reset. I could remember every loop, every failed attempt to escape, every identical conversation with the hiking couple, but they seemed to have no memory of previous encounters. Each time they passed my campsite, they reacted as if they were seeing me for the first time. Do you know what it's like to live the same day dozens of times? At first, it's merely frustrating. Then it becomes frightening. Eventually, it starts to feel like a form of torture designed specifically for your mind. You know exactly what's going to happen, exactly when it will happen, but you're powerless to change any of it. I began to understand why animals in captivity sometimes develop repetitive behaviors. When your environment never changes, when every stimulus arrives on an identical schedule, your mind starts to fracture from monotony. After what felt like 2 weeks of repetitions, those always the same Saturday according to every clock and calendar, I started experimenting with more extreme measures. I tried damaging my car, so I couldn't attempt to leave. I tried setting up camp in different locations within the park. I even tried staying awake for the entire day, hoping to disrupt whatever mechanism was causing the reset. Still nothing. For hours, 28 minutes and 17 seconds. Deer. 5 hours, 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Hiking couple. 6 hours, 47 minutes and 13 seconds. Sunset begins. Midnight. Rain starts. And then I'd wake up to my phone, showing October 16th once again. The isolation was the worst part. I was surrounded by people, park rangers, other campers, hikers on the trails, but none of them remembered our previous interactions. I tried explaining my situation to a ranger during one loop, describing in detail everything that would happen throughout the day. She listened politely, but clearly thought I was having some sort of breakdown. And maybe I was. Maybe the stress of my job, combined with the isolation of solo camping, had finally pushed me over the edge into a complete psychotic break. Maybe I was sitting in a psychiatric ward somewhere, living out this elaborate delusion, while doctors tried to bring me back to reality. But if that were true, how could I predict events with such precision? How could I know that the couple would say, "Come on, live a little," at exactly 5 hours, 4 minutes, and 7 seconds, or that the squirrel would knock over my coffee cup at precisely 5 hours, 47 minutes, and 9 seconds? During one loop, I'd stopped counting them after 30. I decided to test the boundaries of whatever was happening to me. If I was trapped in some sort of temporal bubble, maybe I could at least understand its limits. I hiked to the highest point in the immediate area, a rocky outcrop that offered views of the surrounding forest. From there, I could see other campsites, other sections of the park, even a stretch of the main highway in the distance. Everything looked normal. Cars moved along the highway at regular intervals. Smoke rose from distant campfires, and I could see hikers on various trails throughout the valley. But were they real? Or were they all part of the same repeating pattern I was trapped in? I spent that loop watching through binoculars, timing the movements of distant figures. And sure enough, every car, every hiker, every wisp of smoke followed an identical pattern to the previous loops. It wasn't just my immediate area that was repeating. It was everything I could observe, as if the entire forest had been locked into the same temporal loop. The scope of it was terrifying. If this was real, if I wasn't simply having an elaborate breakdown, then something had trapped Not just me, but potentially hundreds of people in an endlessly repeating day. But why? And how? I'm not a religious person, but I started wondering if this was some sort of purgatory. Had I died without realizing it? Was this my punishment for some forgotten sin? To relive the same peaceful day for eternity? But that didn't feel right either. If this was the afterlife, surely it would be more obviously supernatural. This felt too mundane, too detailed, too perfectly consistent with normal reality, except for the repetition. During what might have been the 40th loop, I made a disturbing discovery. I was hiking on a trail I'd avoided in previous loops, exploring areas of the park I hadn't visited before. About 2 miles from my campsite, I found another camper, a woman in her 30s, sitting by a small creek, staring at the water with an expression of profound despair. "Excuse me," I said, approaching carefully. "Are you all right?" She looked up at me with eyes that held the same haunted awareness I'd been feeling for weeks. "What day is it?" she asked. "October 16th. I replied automatically, then paused. "But you already know that, don't you?" She nodded slowly. "How many times have you lived it?" My heart raced. "You're experiencing the loops too?" 47 times, she said. "I've been counting. The same day, over and over. I wake up in my tent at exactly 7:23 a.m. It rains at midnight. Everything repeats perfectly except my memories." I sat down beside her, feeling a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't insane. Terror that whatever was happening was affecting multiple people. "How long have you been camping here?" I asked. "I arrived on October 15th, just like you probably did. Been trying to leave ever since the loop started. But the roads just lead back to my campsite." We compared experiences, and they were nearly identical. The same temporal prison, the same failed escape attempts, the same growing awareness that we were trapped in something far beyond our understanding. "There's something else," she said. "I found 2 other campers experiencing the same thing. We're all trapped in different parts of the forest, all living the same day. But here's the strange part. We can only find each other if we actively search. Otherwise, we're isolated in our own little pockets of repetition." She let me meet the others, a retired teacher named Frank and a young grad student called Miguel. All of them had the same hollow-eyed look of people who've been psychologically ground down by impossible repetition. All of them had tried everything we could think of to break free. "We think it started on October 15th, Frank explained. "The day we all arrived. Something happened that night. Something that locked us into this loop." "But what?" I asked. I didn't see anything unusual. Just went to sleep and woke up the next day. "That's just it," Miguel said. "None of us remember anything unusual about that first night. But something must have happened. Something that trapped us here. We spent several loops working together, trying to solve the puzzle of our imprisonment. We mapped the boundaries of the temporal bubble. It extended roughly 5 miles in all directions from the center of the campground. We documented every repeated event, looking for patterns or anomalies. We even tried various forms of what Miguel jokingly called temporal engineering, attempts to disrupt the loop through coordinated actions. Nothing worked. October 16th just kept happening. But during our investigations, we made another disturbing discovery. We weren't the only ones who, after what felt like 2 weeks of repetitions, those always the same Saturday according to every clock and calendar, I started experimenting with more extreme measures. I tried damaging my car, so I couldn't attempt to leave. I tried setting up camp in different locations within the park. I even tried staying awake for the entire day, hoping to disrupt whatever mechanism was causing the reset. Still nothing. For hours, 28 minutes and 17 seconds. Dear. 5 hours, 3 minutes and 42 seconds. hiking couple. 6 hours, 47 minutes, and 13 seconds. Sunset begins. Midnight, rain starts. And then I'd wake up to my phone, showing October 16th once again. The isolation was the worst part. I was surrounded by people, park rangers, other campers, hikers on the trails, but none of them remembered our previous interactions. I tried explaining my situation to a ranger during one loop, describing in detail everything that would happen throughout the day. She listened politely, but clearly thought I was having some sort of breakdown. And maybe I was. Maybe the stress of my job, combined with the isolation of solo camping, had finally pushed me over the edge into a complete psychotic break. Maybe I was sitting in a psychiatric ward somewhere, living out this elaborate delusion, while doctors try to bring me back to reality. But if that were true, how could I predict events with such precision? How could I know that the couple would say, "Come on, live a little," at exactly 5 hours, 4 minutes, and 7 seconds, or that the squirrel would knock over my coffee cup at precisely 5 hours, 47 minutes, and 9 seconds? During one loop, I'd stopped counting them after 30. I decided to test the boundaries of whatever was happening to me. If I was trapped in some sort of temporal bubble, maybe I could at least understand its limits. I hiked to the highest point in the immediate area, a rocky outcrop that offered views of the surrounding forest. From there, I could see other campsites, other sections of the park, even a stretch of the main highway in the distance. Everything looked normal. Cars moved along the highway at regular intervals. Smoke rose from distant campfires, and I could see hikers on various trails throughout the valley. But were they real, or were they all part of the same repeating pattern I was trapped in? I spent that loop watching through binoculars, timing the movements of distant figures. And sure enough, every car, every hiker, every wisp of smoke followed an identical pattern to the previous loops. It wasn't just my immediate area that was repeating. It was everything I could observe, as if the entire forest had been locked into the same temporal loop. The scope of it was terrifying. If this was real, if I wasn't simply having an elaborate breakdown, then something had trapped not just me, but potentially hundreds of people in an endlessly repeating day. But why? And how? I'm not a religious person, but I started wondering if this was some sort of purgatory. Had I died without realizing it? Was this my punishment for some forgotten sin? To relive the same peaceful day for eternity? But that didn't feel right either. If this was the afterlife, surely it would be more obviously supernatural. This felt too mundane, too detailed, too perfectly consistent with normal reality, except for the repetition. During what might have been the 40th loop, I made a disturbing discovery. I was hiking on a trail I'd avoided in previous loops, exploring areas of the park I hadn't visited before. About 2 miles from my campsite, I found another camper, a woman in her 30s, sitting by a small creek, staring at the water with an expression of profound despair. "Excuse me," I said, approaching carefully. "Are you all right?" She looked up at me with eyes that held the same haunted awareness I'd been feeling for weeks. "What day is it?" she asked. "October 16th. I replied automatically, then paused. "But you already know that, don't you?" She nodded slowly. "How many times have you lived it?" My heart raced. "You're experiencing the loops too?" 47 times, she said. "I've been counting. The same day, over and over. I wake up in my tent at exactly 7:23 a.m. It rains at midnight. Everything repeats perfectly except my memories." I sat down beside her, feeling a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't insane. Terror that whatever was happening was affecting multiple people. "How long have you been camping here?" I asked. "I arrived on October 15th, just like you probably did. Been trying to leave ever since the loop started. But the roads just lead back to my campsite." We compared experiences. and they were nearly identical. The same temporal prison, the same failed escape attempts, the same growing awareness that we were trapped in something far beyond our understanding. "There's something else," she said. "I found 2 other campers experiencing the same thing. We're all trapped in different parts of the forest, all living the same day. But here's the strange part. We can only find each other if we actively search. Otherwise, we're isolated in our own little pockets of repetition." She let me meet the others, a retired teacher named Frank and a young grad student called Miguel. All of them had the same hollow-eyed look of people who've been psychologically ground down by impossible repetition. All of them had tried everything we could think of to break free. "We think it started on October 15th, Frank explained, "the day we all arrived. Something happened that night, something that locked us into this loop." "But what?" I asked. "I didn't see anything unusual. Just went to sleep and woke up the next day." "That's just it," Miguel said. "None of us remember anything unusual about that first night. But something must have happened, something that trapped us here. We spent several loops working together, trying to solve the puzzle of our imprisonment. We mapped the boundaries of the temporal bubble. It extended roughly 5 miles in all directions from the center of the campground. We documented every repeated event, looking for patterns or anomalies. We even tried various forms of what Miguel jokingly called temporal engineering, attempts to disrupt the loop through coordinated actions. Nothing worked. October 16th just kept happening. But during our investigations, we made another disturbing discovery. We weren't the only ones in a remote section of the forest. We found evidence of previous campers, old tent sites, abandoned gear, even carved messages in tree bark. Messages that suggested other people had experienced the same temporal loops in years past. Day 127, still trapped, was carved into one oak tree. The same day forever was scratched into another. Most chilling of all was a message carved deep into a boulder. "Don't try to leave. It only makes it worse." How many people had been caught in this place? How many had lived through endless repetitions of the same day before us? And what had happened to them? We never found out. Despite our searching, we never encountered any of the previous victims. Perhaps they had found a way to escape. Perhaps they'd simply vanished. Or perhaps they were still there, trapped in their own isolated loops, living through different days and different years, all of us existing in the same physical space, but separated by temporal barriers we couldn't cross. I don't know how long I was trapped there. My memory of the loops becomes hazy after a while. The human mind isn't designed to retain dozens of identical experiences, but it felt like months. Months of the same weather, the same conversations, the same sunset, the same midnight rain. And then one morning it stopped. I woke up in my tent, checked my phone, and saw October 17th, not October 16th. The next day, the day that should have come all those loops ago. I packed up my campsite faster than I'd ever packed anything in my life and drove straight for the park exit. This time, the roads led where they were supposed to lead. I reached the boundary, past the park sign, and didn't look back. I drove all the way to Atlanta without stopping, terrified that if I paused for even a moment, I might find myself back in that temporal prison. That was over a year ago now. I've never returned to Cherokee National Forest, and I never will. But sometimes when I'm having trouble sleeping or when the rain sounds just like it did during those endless midnights, I wonder about the others. Frank, Miguel, the woman by the creek, whose name I never learned. Did they escape too? Or are they still there, trapped in their eternal October 16th, living the same day over and over while the rest of the world moves forward? And I wonder about the messages carved in those trees. The people who came before us, who experienced the same impossible repetition. How long were they trapped? Years? Decades? Most of all, I wonder if it will happen again. If I'll wake up one morning to find myself reliving a day I've already lived, caught once more in a loop I can't break or understand. Because here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. I still don't know why it happened. I don't know what caused the loops, what eventually ended them, or what prevented me from escaping earlier. It felt random, arbitrary, like being struck by lightning made of time itself. If you ever find yourself camping in Cherokee National Forest, pay attention to the date on your phone when you wake up each morning. If you ever see the same day twice, if you ever witness the same conversation repeated word for word, if you ever feel like you're living in a world where everything happens on schedule except your growing awareness of the repetition, start looking for the others. You won't be alone. None of us ever are, trapped in our separate loops in that cursed forest. And whatever you do, don't try to leave. It only makes it worse. Have you ever noticed how your shadow sometimes seems to have a mind of its own? Not in broad daylight, of course, but in that peculiar twilight when the sun sits low and shadows grow long and strange. Most of the time, we don't pay attention to our shadows. They're just there, following us about like faithful pets. But what would you do if you were stopped following? I learned the answer to that question during what should have been a perfectly ordinary camping trip to Cherokee National Forest. It was late September 2020, just as the autumn colors were beginning to show. I'd driven down from Chattanooga, needing desperately to escape the suffocating atmosphere of working from home during the pandemic. After months of video calls and isolation, I craved the simple pleasure of being alone with nature. The campsite I'd chosen was beautifully secluded, nestled in a grove of ancient oaks whose massive trunks spoke of centuries weathered in peaceful solitude. There's something profoundly calming about old trees, isn't there? They've stood witness to so much history, survived so many storms, yet they remain rooted, patient, enduring. I felt my stress beginning to melt away the moment I stepped out of my car. I spent the afternoon setting up camp and exploring the immediate area. The forest was magnificent. Towering trees draped in Spanish moss, crystalline streams winding between moss-covered boulders, and everywhere that sense of timeless tranquility that only truly wild places possess. By evening, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. As the sun began to set, I built a small campfire and settled in with a book and a thermos of coffee. There's something magical about reading by firelight in the wilderness, the way the flames dance across the pages while darkness settles around you like a comfortable blanket. I was completely absorbed in my novel when I first noticed something odd about my shadow. The fire was casting multiple shadows of my form onto the trees behind me, which is perfectly normal. Firelight creates complex, shifting patterns of light and shadow, and I've always found them fascinating to watch. But as I glanced up from my book, one of the shadows caught my attention. It wasn't moving with me. I was sitting quite still, reading, but one of my shadows, cast onto a large oak tree about 10 feet away, was slowly turning its head from side to side, as if looking around the campsite with curiosity. I set down my book and deliberately moved my head to the left. My other shadows moved accordingly, but the one on the oak tree remained motionless, still appearing to examine its surroundings independently. Trick of the light, I murmured to myself, a perfectly reasonable explanation. Flickering firelight can create all sorts of optical illusions, especially when you're tired and your eyes are adjusting between the bright flames and the surrounding darkness. But as I watched, the shadow raised what appeared to be its arm and waved. I wasn't waving. I was sitting perfectly still, hands resting on my book, staring at this impossible shadow that was greeting me like an old friend. My heart started racing, and I felt that peculiar chill that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with witnessing something that shouldn't exist. I waved back, feeling rather foolish but unable to resist the impulse. The shadow waved again, more enthusiastically this time, then appeared to beckon me closer to the tree. Every rational part of my mind was screaming warnings. Shadows don't behave independently. They're not conscious entities capable of invitation or communication. What I was seeing had to be some combination of fatigue, firelight, and an overactive imagination. But curiosity is a powerful thing, isn't it? And there was something almost playful about the shadow's gestures, something that suggested mischief rather than malevolence. I stood up and walked toward the oak tree, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadow. As I approached, it seemed to grow more excited, nodding vigorously, though I certainly wasn't nodding, and continued to wave me closer. When I reached the tree, I held up my hand and pressed it against the bark where the shadow's hand appeared to be. For just a moment, I could have sworn I felt warmth emanating from the tree, as if the shadow possessed some form of physical presence. Then the strangest thing happened. The shadow stepped away from the tree. Not faded away, not dissolved as shadows do when their light source is blocked. It literally stepped sideways, moving from the oak tree to a smaller maple nearby, maintaining its perfect human silhouette throughout the transition. I stared in absolute amazement as my shadow, for I was certain it was mine, despite its independent behavior, walked from tree to tree around my campsite, always maintaining the same relative position, but clearly moving of its own volition. "This is impossible," I said aloud, and immediately felt foolish for talking to the shadow. But the shadow stopped moving and turned toward me, tilting its head as if listening. I tried an experiment. "If you can understand me, nod once." The shadow nodded once. My skin erupted in goosebumps. This was beyond any rational explanation I could construct. Shadows don't listen, don't respond, don't demonstrate understanding. Yet here was mine, clearly engaged in some form of communication. "Are you me?" I asked, feeling increasingly absurd but unable to stop myself. The shadow shook its head, then pointed at me, then at itself, then made a gesture I couldn't interpret. Something like pulling or separating motions with its hands. "I don't understand," I said. The shadow repeated the gesture more slowly, and this time I thought I grasped its meaning. It was showing me something being pulled apart, separated, like a shadow being detached from its owner. A chill ran down my spine. Was it trying to tell me that it had somehow become disconnected from me? That it was no longer bound by the normal rules that govern shadows? I looked down at my feet, expecting to see my normal shadow cast by the firelight. But there was nothing there, despite the bright flames behind me. Despite the perfect conditions for shadow creation, I was casting no shadow at all except for the one walking independently around my campsite. I spun around, checking the ground in all directions. Nothing. It was as if I had become some sort of vampire from folklore, a being that cast no reflection or shadow. But unlike those mythical creatures, my shadow still existed. It had simply gained independence. How is this possible? I whispered. The shadow approached one of the trees near my campfire and began making gestures that looked almost like writing motions. After a moment, I realized what it was trying to do. I grabbed a stick from my pile of firewood and held it out toward the tree. "Use this," I said, feeling increasingly detached from reality. The shadow reached the stick, and impossibly, its shadow hand grasped a real object. I could feel the stick being tugged from my grip by invisible fingers. Then I watched in fascination as the stick began moving against the tree bark, apparently held by my shadow, carving letters into the wood. "Stuck." It spelled out in rough letters. "You're stuck." I asked, "Stuck how?" The shadow pointed at itself, then at me, then made that pulling apart gesture again. Then it pointed deeper into the forest and made walking motions with its fingers. "You want to go somewhere, but you can't because you're connected to me?" The shadow nodded enthusiastically, then shook its head in frustration. pointing at itself and then making a gesture like tugging on an invisible rope around its waist. I was beginning to understand, though the understanding brought no comfort. Somehow, my shadow had gained consciousness and independence, but remained tethered to me in some way. It wanted to go somewhere deeper into the forest, apparently, but couldn't leave my vicinity. "Where do you want to go?" I asked. The shadow pointed toward the darkness beyond my campfire's reach, into the depths of Cherokee National Forest. Then it began making urgent gestures, as if time were running out for something important. Despite every instinct screaming that this was madness, I found myself considering its request. What harm could there be in taking a short walk? If my shadow needed to go somewhere, perhaps accompanying it would help resolve whatever impossible situation I'd stumbled into. "You want me to follow you into the forest?" Vigorous nodding. At night, in unfamiliar territory. More nodding, accompanied by gestures that seemed to indicate urgency. I looked at my watch. Nearly midnight. This was exactly the sort of decision that people in horror films make right before everything goes terribly wrong. But what alternative did I have? Leave my shadow here while I slept? Try to ignore this impossible situation and hope it resolved itself? "If I follow you," I said, "will you promise to bring me back safely?" The shadow placed what appeared to be its hand over its heart and nodded solemnly, against my better judgment. I grabbed my torch and followed my independent shadow into the Cherokee wilderness. The forest at night was a different world entirely. During the day, it had seemed peaceful, welcoming, a sanctuary from the stresses of civilization. But in darkness, every sound seemed amplified and potentially threatening. The rustle of leaves could be wind or wildlife. The crack of branches might indicate falling deadwood or something large moving through the underbrush. My shadow walked ahead of me, moving from tree to tree, always visible in the beam of my torch, but never casting a shadow of its own. It seemed to know exactly where it was going, leading me along game trails I hadn't noticed during my daytime explorations. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The shadow maintained a steady pace, occasionally looking back to ensure I was following, but never hesitating about the route. Whatever was drawing it deeper into the forest, it had a specific destination in mind. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center stood a circle of ancient standing stones, weathered and moss-covered, clearly predating European settlement by centuries. Cherokee ceremonial stones, perhaps marking some location of spiritual significance. But it wasn't the stones that made me catch my breath. It was what surrounded them. Shadows, dozens of them. Human shadows standing around the stone circle, all perfectly detailed and clearly visible despite having no visible source to cast them. Men, women, children, an entire community of shadows gathered in the darkness of Cherokee National Forest. My shadow approached the circle and was greeted by the others with what appeared to be gestures of welcome and relief. They embraced, if shadows could be said to embrace, and began what looked like an animated conversation conducted entirely through gestures and body language. I stood at the edge of the clearing, torch in hand, trying to process what I was witnessing, a gathering of independent shadows, meeting in some sort of ancient ceremonial space, clearly operating according to rules I couldn't begin to understand. One of the shadows, taller than the others, with a bearing that suggested age and authority, approached me. It pointed at itself, then at the stones, then made sweeping gestures that seemed to encompass the entire forest. "You've been here a long time," I said, though I had no idea if my interpretation was correct. The elderly shadow nodded, then pointed at my shadow and made welcoming gestures. "My shadow belongs here, with all of you." More nodding. And now several of the other shadows were approaching, all making similar welcoming gestures toward my shadow. I began to understand. This was some sort of gathering place for shadows that had become detached from their owners. My shadow had been drawn here by instinct or recognition, seeking its own kind. But why had it become detached in the first place? I tried asking, but the shadows couldn't provide answers I could understand. Their communication was limited to gestures, and some concepts don't translate well into body language. All I could determine was that they'd been here for a very long time, that they were somehow connected to this place, and that my shadow was welcome to join them. But what would that mean for me? Could a person survive without their shadow? In folklore, losing one's shadow was often associated with losing one's soul or humanity. Was I about to discover whether those old stories contained literal truth? My shadow approached me and made what appeared to be apologetic gestures. It pointed at me, then at itself, then at the gathering of shadows, clearly torn between its connection to me and its desire to remain with its own kind. "You want to stay here," I said. It wasn't really a question. Reluctant nodding. "But you're worried about what will happen to me." More nodding, accompanied by gestures of distress. I looked around at the other shadows, wondering what had become of their original owners. Were they still alive somewhere, walking through a world without shadows? Or had the separation been fatal? The elderly shadow seemed to sense my concern. It approached and began making elaborate gestures, pointing at the stones, the forest, the sky, as it tried to explain something fundamental about the nature of shadows and their relationship to their owners. I caught fragments of meaning, something about balance, about connection, about the forest itself being a place where normal rules didn't always apply. But the full explanation remained beyond my grasp. What I did understand was the choice I was facing. I could try to force my shadow to return with me, potentially condemning it to an existence of being tethered to someone it could no longer properly belong to. Or I could let it stay here, among its own kind, and face whatever consequences came from being shadowless. "If I let you stay," I asked my shadow, "will I be all right?" My shadow approached the elderly shadow, and they appeared to confer. After several minutes of animated discussion, the elderly shadow approached me and made a gesture that seemed to indicate uncertainty, followed by a motion suggesting that time would tell. Not exactly reassuring, but perhaps honest. I looked at my shadow, standing among the others in that impossible gathering, and realized I had already made my decision. Whatever was happening here was beyond my understanding, but it was clearly important to my shadow. Who was I to deny it the chance to exist where it belonged? "Stay if you want to," I said. "I'll manage somehow." My shadow rushed to me and embraced my legs. I could actually feel the cool touch of its arms, another impossibility to add to the growing list. Then it stepped back and bowed deeply, a gesture of profound gratitude. The other shadows gathered around, acknowledging my decision with what appeared to be approval and respect. The elderly shadow approached and touched my forehead with its shadowy hand. For a moment, I felt a strange tingling sensation, as if something was being adjusted or rewired in my mind. Then they all began to fade, not disappearing but becoming translucent, harder to see. Within minutes, the clearing appeared empty except for the ancient stones and me standing alone with my torch. But I knew they were still there, existing in whatever realm shadows inhabit when they're not being cast by firelight or sunlight. My shadow among them, finally where it belonged. I made my way back to my campsite, following my torch beam and hoping I could retrace the route. It took longer than expected. The forest seemed different somehow, more maze-like, but eventually I saw the glow of my dying campfire through the trees. I stoked the fire back to life and sat down to consider what had just happened. In the firelight, I looked at the ground around my chair and confirmed what I already knew. I cast no shadow. The flames threw light in all directions, but I remained shadowless. Surprisingly, I felt fine, not weakened or diminished, not missing some essential part of myself. If anything, I felt lighter, less burdened by something I hadn't even realized was weighing me down. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next morning, I packed up my campsite and prepared to return to Chattanooga. As I loaded my car, I noticed other campers staring at me with expressions of confusion and concern. A family at the neighboring site seemed particularly disturbed, the children whispering to their parents and pointing in my direction. I looked down at myself, checking for anything that might explain their reaction. Clean clothes, normal appearance, nothing obviously amiss. Then I realized what they were seeing, or rather, what they weren't seeing. Despite the bright morning sunlight, I cast no shadow. The family quickly packed up their camp and left, clearly uncomfortable with my presence. Other campers followed suit throughout the morning, until I was alone in the campground with only the park rangers, who seemed oddly unaffected by my condition. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" one of them said as he passed my campsite, as if there was nothing unusual about a shadowless camper. "Beautiful," I agreed, wondering if the rangers were somehow accustomed to the forest's peculiarities. I drove home without incident, though I noticed that other drivers seemed to give my car a wider berth than usual. It was as if people could sense something different about me, even from a distance. That was 3 years ago. I've learned to live without my shadow, though it took some adjustment. People are uncomfortable around me, though most can't articulate why. Children are especially sensitive. They'll stare and point and ask their parents why the man doesn't have a shadow. I've had to become careful about when and where I go out. Bright, sunny days are the most challenging, when my lack of shadow is most obvious. I prefer cloudy weather, indoor venues, evening activities, times and places where shadows are less noticeable. But there are compensations. I sleep deeply and dreamlessly. I'm never troubled by nightmares or anxiety. It's as if whatever psychological weight shadows carry, the weight of our darker impulses perhaps, or our capacity for self-doubt, was lifted when mine gained independence. I've returned to Cherokee National Forest several times since that night. I never see the shadows during the day, but sometimes when twilight falls and the conditions are just right, I catch glimpses of them moving between the trees. My shadow among them, healthy and happy in its chosen home. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I tried to reclaim it, whether the separation could be reversed, whether I could return to being a normal person who casts a shadow like everyone else. But whenever I consider it, I remember how grateful my shadow seemed when I let it stay where it belonged. Who am I to call it back to a life of being? If you ever find yourself camping in Cherokee National Forest, pay attention to your shadow as evening falls. Watch how it moves in the firelight, how it responds to your gestures. Most of the time, it will behave exactly as shadows should, following your movements, mimicking your actions, remaining properly connected to you. But if it ever starts to move independently, if it ever waves when you're not waving or walks when you're sitting still, don't be afraid. It's not trying to harm you. It's just looking for where it belongs. And sometimes what's best for our shadows isn't what's most convenient for us. The choice when it comes will be entirely yours. But remember, some things are more important than convenience. Some connections run deeper than physical attachment. And sometimes, letting go is the kindest thing you can do for the parts of yourself that no longer fit the life you're living. Your shadow knows where it belongs. The question is, are you brave enough to let go there?